This should be found on the last page of your lecture guide. And what it's going to do is it's going to be taking a look at food, and we're going to be picking lasagna. It's one of my favorites. And because it has polysaccharides, fats, and proteins, three of the major macromolecules that we looked at this chapter. And the ultimate goal of eating food is really not to satisfy our bellies, but it's to provide this ATP down here, this ATP energy which is needed. This is the currency of the cell. This is what's needed to enable your muscles to contract, for your nerves to function properly, for your cells to even get the appropriate nutrients inside of them through the membranes. So we're going to take a look at each of these food products of polysaccharides, fats, and proteins. We're going to start off with polysaccharides because that's what we did actually first in our lecture. So in the lasagna, our polysaccharides that we're going to be looking at, these are going to be our carbs. So another name for polysaccharides are going to be carbs. Where do we find the carbs? The carbs is going to be located in the pasta, in those flat noodles of the lasagna. So this is made up of lots of starched molecules. So just to remind you what starch looks like, starch is made out of glucose. So here's a glucose monomer. Remember, glucose is shaped like a hexagon. And these are linked to each other like this. I'm just going to draw three of these going across like this. And then branching off of this is going to be another hexagon over here. So this is our starch from our plant product because that's where our pasta is made out of. It's made out of wheat. Okay, and that wheat is primarily composed up of starch, which is a food for the growing seedling. So here's our branched starch. It's a polysaccharide, thousands of units long. So I'm just going to say times 1,000. So this is going to go into your mouth, and even inside your mouth, you're going to start digesting your pasta with your saliva. So you're going to digest your starch. It'll further get digested in your small intestines as it passes your pancreas. Your pancreas is an amazing organ inside your body. It makes enzymes that are going to digest both starch. They also digest fats, and they also digest proteins, these enzymes that are spit out by your pancreas. So it's not only an organ that's used to control your glucose levels in your body, but it also secretes enzymes for digestion. So these chains, these long chains of starch, just like in the lab that we did, these are going to be broken down into individual glucoses, individual rings. So now we have a 6-carbon glucose. We've got thousands of them. So just like the lab where I added the spit to the starch and we tested for the glucose, and there was a large amount of glucose that was present. So here's a 6-carbon sugar. It's then going to be split in this process called glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to take that 3-carbon sugar and it's going to turn it into a 6-carbon sugar, and it's going to make it into a 3-carbon sugar. This is what we have from the last lecture of showing what happens to the 6-carbon sugar. We're going to rip off our carbon dioxide. We're taking off 1 carbon. We previously had 3 carbons. Now we have this molecule here, which is acetyl coenzyme A. This is the 2-carbon. This 2-carbon then enters into what's called the Kreb cycle inside your mitochondria. It meets up with a 4-carbon sugar. 2-carbon plus 4-carbon equals 6-carbon. In the process, a carbon dioxide is going to get ripped off. If we take off one of the carbons from the 6, we now have a 5 carbon sugar. And if we again take off another carbon dioxide, that's going to give us a 4 carbon sugar. So let's follow the process again. We've got our food lasagna. It has carbs inside the pasta. These carbs are going to be starch. They're branched polysaccharides, thousands of units long. We digest them in your mouth and also in your lower gut and your small intestines. They're broken down into individual hexagons of glucose. They're then split into 3 carbons. We release lots of carbon dioxide from this, which we breathe off. A 2 carbon enters the Kreb cycle, and then 2 plus 4 is 6. We release a 5 carbon, then a 4 carbon. All the while it produces energy, which goes into what's called the electron transport, which we are not going to be looking at today, to produce ATP. So that's our carbs. Let's take a look at our fats. What's the fat that's inside lasagna? Primarily, we're going to say it's going to be the cheese. So these fats come in the form of what are called triglycerides. They have a 3 carbon backbone and they have these long hydrocarbon chains that look like this. So fats are triglycerides. Triglyceride. Triglyceride. And these chains, again, they have about a 3 carbon backbone, and this is called the glycerol. So this is the 3 carbon backbone right here that goes there. The rest of these chains are called fatty acid chains, and they range between 16 and 20 carbons long. These are the fatty acid chains of the triglyceride. So when this is broken down in your body, it produces the 3 carbon glycerol and these 1, 2, 3 chains of the fatty acids. So we have these fatty acid chains. Let's take a look at this. This is a 3 carbon. This 3 carbon is called glycerol. It's actually like this 3 carbon right here. The carbon dioxide will then get ripped off of that 3 carbon to make acetyl coenzyme A. It will then enter the Krebs cycle, releasing carbon dioxide, making energy to produce ATP. These 16 to 20 carbon chains, these are carbon, 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 carbon chains. These guys are cut into 2 carbons. So you have these 2 carbons that now are going to enter in, at this point right here, into the Krebs cycle. It will enter the Krebs cycle, releasing carbon dioxide, making energy to produce ATP. We've completely digested all of our carbs into from 6 carbon to a 3 carbon to a 2 carbon to the Krebs. Many carbons, the 3 carbon to the 2 carbon to the Krebs, 16 to 20 carbons into 2 carbons into the Krebs. Everything ends up in the Krebs cycle. Let's take a look at proteins. This is going to be your meat. Okay, another name for proteins. Proteins, the monomer of your proteins are called peptides. This is many peptides long, and so these are called your polypeptides. So polypeptides are then broken down into individual amino acids. Another name for an amino acid, this is just a peptide. You can call it a monopeptide because we call them dipeptides, we call them polypeptides, but if you have a single peptide, typically you don't call it a monopeptide, it's just called a peptide. This is your amino acid. What does the amino acid look like? The amino acid has a nitrogen and 2 carbons. So if you remember, polysaccharides have carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, C6H12O6. Triglycerides are primarily hydrocarbons, just lots of carbon and hydrogen chains. But proteins have nitrogen in them. it has this structure called an amine group. Here's the amine. Here's the side group. And it also has what's called the acid group, carboxylic acid. So here's my amine group, here's my acid group. That's why it's called an amino acid. Well, if you take a look at this, this is a 2-carbon molecule as well with an extra NH2 on it. What happens is a tricky process right here where the NH2 gets ripped off and it produces lots of ammonia. So we've got these 2 carbons. These 2 carbons actually are going to enter into the Kreb cycle. They'll enter the Kreb cycle. They will then produce carbon dioxide energy to make ATP. But now we have this NH2, which gets converted to NH3. This is ammonia, and it's toxic. Ammonia is toxic for our body. So what our body does is it converts it into a less toxic material. It attaches the NH3 onto a carbon. And it looks like this. There's another one up here. So the ammonia then gets converted into this molecule here. This molecule is called urea. Now, while urea is less toxic than ammonia, it is still toxic and needs to be removed by our bodies. This urea then goes to your kidneys via what's called the ureter, and then that goes to the bladder, via the ureter. So now it's in your bladder, and then it comes out your urethra in the form of urine. So our urine contains a toxic nitrogen compound called urea, which came from the ammonia, which came from the amino acid, which comes from your proteins. The whole goal of this was to show you that everything that you eat ends up in the Kreb cycle. Big star down here. Everything eaten has carbon-carbon bonds. It has them in glucose, which is split into 3-carbon, which becomes a 2-carbon. It's found in your fats, in primarily your fatty acid chains, your 3 chains between 16 and 20 carbons. They're carbon-carbon bonds. And your proteins even have these carbon-carbon bonds. This energy inside these carbon-carbon bonds, this is like the glow stick. And the glow stick is equal to energy. And when you take ADP and the phosphorus, this has been ATP that's been used up. So it starts off as ATP, breaks down to this, and is used by your body. We need to regenerate that ATP. How do we regenerate the ATP? We form ATP by using the energy from the carbon-carbon bonds, which is found in the proteins, found in the fats, and found in the sugars that we eat. So anything that we eat in terms of food ends up in the Kreb cycle. The Kreb cycle creates energy, which powers the manufacturing or remanufacturing, the reassembly of the ADP and the phosphate back into ATP, so that we now have another source of energy to power our muscles, to power our brains, to power our nerves, to actually just power the cell to do normal cellular functioning. So that's it. It ends here. It ends with food.